Jimmy said, well, since he studied engineering, we'll put him in the combat engineers. So they did.
For millions of movie fans, it's easy to assume that Hollywood stardom is the pinnacle of anyone's ambitions. Why would a celebrated actor, adored by countless admirers, ever trade bright lights and glamorous parties for the mud, grit, and danger of a battlefield? Yet during World War II, that's exactly what happened. Countless film stars, some of them at the height of their careers, answered the call to serve for the love of their country that make our America great. Now, let's enter that world and meet the high-profile actors who risked everything. The call to serve, unexpected motivations. It's remarkable how World War II's wide-reaching impact left no corner of society untouched. For many American and British actors, the impetus to enlist came swiftly, sometimes triggered by personal tragedy. Consider Clark Gable, often referred to as the King of Hollywood. His motivation wasn't just patriotism, it was heartbreak. When his wife, the beloved actress Carole Lombard, died tragically in a plane crash in 1942, she had been in the midst of a war bond tour. Overcome with grief and determined to honor her memory, Gable marched straight into the Army Air Forces. He was 41 years old, which in that era was considered well beyond typical enlistment age. Studios, agents, and fans objected, but Gable's mind was made up. And so the man revered for his dashing on-screen presence became another face in the crowd of raw recruits. Just one more volunteer determined to do his part. For others, the call to serve was equally passionate, if less personal. Jimmy Stewart, a Hollywood icon famous for his earnest everyman roles, had deep family military roots. His ancestors fought in the Civil War, and his own father had served in World War I. Stewart felt compelled to follow that path. Initially rejected for being underweight, he stood 6'3" and was considered too slim for active duty. Stewart refused to accept the verdict. He bulked up by pounding down milkshakes, steak, and spaghetti until he finally made the cut. The next thing he knew, he was training as a flight instructor for B-17 bombers, an unexpectedly dangerous occupation, especially when he soon found himself commanding real missions against German forces. Personal conviction took many shapes. Tony Bennett, who would later become an iconic singer, was drafted into the U.S. Army at just 18. He saw service in Europe, including brutal combat in Germany, and faced open discrimination within the military itself. While Bennett's musical voice would one day captivate the world, his early Army experience taught him harsh lessons about racial prejudice and personal sacrifice. All these men, whether spurred by heartbreak, family legacy, or a patriotic sense of duty, discovered that glamorous recognition had little meaning on the battlefield. Secret missions and covert operations. When people think of espionage, they may imagine intense spy thrillers or hush-hush government agencies working in the shadows. Rarely do they envision well-known film stars at the heart of such covert activities. Yet that was the reality for Christopher Lee, a towering figure, both literally and figuratively, who later became famous for portraying Dracula, Scaramanga, and Saruman. Born in 1922, Lee started down the path of military service when he volunteered to fight for Finland in the Winter War against the Soviet Union. That alone was an unexpected turn for someone who would eventually grace so many movie screens. But his involvement deepened when he joined the Royal Air Force. Officially, he worked in RAF intelligence across North Africa and Italy. Unofficially, rumors linked him to the Special Operations Executive, an ultra-secret organization tasked with sabotage, espionage, and supporting resistance movements behind enemy lines. Lee, for his part, rarely spoke about his war experiences, bound as he was by the Official Secrets Act. Every so often, he'd drop tantalizing hints, like acknowledging he'd witnessed horrors up close on a scale that left him nearly desensitized to death. He never elaborated, leaving fans to wonder which glimpses of shadowy missions might have shaped his later mesmerizing and often menacing screen presence. The war turned him into a polyglot and intelligence expert who slipped in and out of danger, an experience that made him eerily comfortable playing villains who danced on the edge of moral darkness. Not all intelligence work during the war had the same cloak and dagger flair, but it was every bit as dangerous. Charlton Heston, for instance, served as a radio operator and aerial gunner on B-25 bombers stationed in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. That posting is less famous than the action in Europe or the Pacific, but it was fraught with peril, punishing cold, sudden storms and Japanese threats lurking along remote coastlines. Heston's role demanded constant vigilance. One simple mistake in radio frequencies or a missed communication could doom an entire flight crew. This quiet, frigid theater, overshadowed by more iconic battlefronts, sharpened the young man's nerves and gave him a sense of discipline that would later serve him well when he took on larger-than-life roles in epics like Ben-Hur. The idea that these well-known performers weren't simply entertaining troops, but actively assisting in top-secret or high-risk missions is a testament to the complexity of double habitude. Fame became irrelevant once they stepped into uniform. Whether they were intercepting codes, scouting enemy lines, or providing critical air support, each star soon realized that an enemy bullet doesn't discriminate. Your box office draw means nothing when you're flying above a flak-filled sky. Near-death escapes and shocking injuries. War spares no one, celebrity or otherwise, from the threat of sudden death and life-altering wounds. One of the most hair-raising stories belongs to James Doohan, forever etched into pop culture as Scotty from Star Trek. Before he donned the iconic engineering uniform, Doohan had been part of the Royal Canadian Artillery. On D-Day, he landed on Juno Beach as part of the Normandy invasion, a crucible for Allied forces pushing into occupied France. That night, in a tragic instance of friendly fire, Doohan was shot 6 times. 4 bullets struck his leg, 1 hit his chest, stopped only by a silver cigarette case, and 1 severed his right middle finger. He miraculously survived, but the injuries ended his frontline service. For the rest of his life, he worked hard to hide his missing finger on camera. Audiences never suspected that the man guiding the USS Enterprise through cosmic dangers had once cheated death under real gunfire. Charles Bronson, famed for his tough-as-nails roles, also came face-to-face with terrifying odds. Enlisting in the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1943, he served as an aerial gunner on B-29 Superfortress bombers. 25 perilous missions over Japan left him haunted by the near-daily threat of being shot out of the sky. Shrapnel wounds earned him the Purple Heart, but the psychological damage was just as lasting. After the war, Bronson channeled that grim, hard-earned resilience into characters that radiated a stoic intensity on screen. Even the inimitable Jimmy Stewart, rising to the rank of colonel during the war, admitted that every flight over German territory felt like stepping into the jaws of death. Whether it was flak peppering the skies or the raw terror of anti-aircraft guns lighting up the horizon, there was never a guarantee of returning to base in one piece. Day after day, mission after mission, these future Hollywood luminaries flirted with fate. A single bullet or a sudden malfunction could have robbed the film world of some of its greatest talents. Sometimes it wasn't the enemy that nearly killed them. Paul Newman, the blue-eyed star who became an icon through roles in Cool Hand Luke and Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, had a miraculous brush with fate. He served as a rear gunner on torpedo bombers stationed on the USS Bunker Hill, a vessel that later got hammered by kamikaze attacks. Newman's pilot caught an ear infection that grounded them on the day the ship was hit. The destruction killed hundreds of sailors. Had his pilot not fallen ill, Newman likely would have been among the casualties, obliterating one of the greatest acting legacies of the 20th century. Humor in hell, the comedic twist. It seems inconceivable that someone as hilariously irreverent as Mel Brooks was once tasked with defusing landmines. Known today for comedic masterpieces like The Producers and Spaceballs, Brooks found himself drafted into the U.S. Army at 17. Instead of entertaining GIs with a stand-up routine, he was doing the unthinkably dangerous work of a combat engineer. In the bitter cold and chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, Brooks had to keep a steady hand while searching for buried explosives. One wrong move and he'd have been gone in an instant. Brooks later joked, "I was a combat engineer. Does that make any sense? The two things I hate most in the world are combat and engineering." But behind the humor lay a grim reality. Every day carried the possibility that he could step on a hidden mine or fail to neutralize one properly. He once told stories about using his comedic wit to diffuse tension among fellow soldiers. When you're that close to a fiery end, even a little laughter can be a powerful weapon against fear. It's ironic that a man who later specialized in making audiences laugh so hard they cried first honed his nerves in such a terrifying environment. He wasn't alone in leveraging humor as a coping mechanism. Although not primarily known as a comedic actor, James Garner, star of Maverick and the Rockford Files, had his own brand of wit that helped him endure the physical and emotional toll of military life. Garner first served with the Merchant Marine near the tail end of World War II, lying about his age to join up. Seasickness hounded him, and at times it must have felt like a cruel cosmic joke that his patriotic act nearly ended with him hunched over the rails of a ship. That comedic spark, that ability to find a grin in adversity, would become part of Garner's on-screen charm. Whether diffusing bombs or braving choppy seas in a cramped vessel, comedic thinking kept these future stars sane. It also shaped their post-war personas, teaching them that quick wits can be just as vital as physical bravery. In fact, those improbable comedic roots would later infuse their performances with an edge of authenticity that audiences found irresistible. Confronting controversies and rumors. While the raw tension of combat is enough to test anyone's spirit, external controversies and swirling rumors added extra layers of drama for some of these wartime actors. One notorious story involved Adolf Hitler supposedly offering a reward for the capture of Clark Gable, illustrating the bizarre intersection between Hollywood celebrity and real interest in a movie star is almost surreal, yet it underscores the role celebrities played in boosting Allied morale. Cap Gable would have been a colossal propaganda win for Germany. Meanwhile, Tony Bennett found himself confronting a different kind of conflict entirely. It wasn't just the Axis powers he had to worry about. It was the racial segregation and discrimination in the U.S. Army. At one point, Bennett stood up for a black friend who was being harassed, which led to Bennett's demotion and reassignment to grave-digging detail. The indignity of that punishment collided with the everyday horrors of combat, further solidifying Bennett's stance as a lifelong champion of civil rights. Later in his career, he would become known for his timeless music, but few realized just how deeply the cause of equality ran in his life until he began speaking about it decades after the war. Even comedic icons had their share of controversy. Mel Brooks joked about how he countered Nazi propaganda with comedic attacks, at times belting out funny or mocking tunes over loudspeakers. There were rumors that this unorthodox approach ruffled some feathers among higher-ups who feared it was disrespectful. But Brooks's method worked wonders for morale, giving exhausted troops a momentary laugh, even when laughter seemed impossible. Not all controversies stemmed from actions on the battlefield. Some were rooted in the tricky question, should stars even be allowed to fight, or are they more useful making propaganda film? Actors like Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, answered that question by proving their usefulness in tangible ways. Autry fearlessly flew transport missions over the Himalayas, the infamous Hump, ferrying supplies to the front lines. He didn't just sing about heroic cowboys. He risked life and limb for the world's most treacherous air route. Meanwhile, back in Hollywood, studios wondered if they were losing one of their biggest box office draws for good. In the end, controversies and rumors came and went, but the authenticity of service remained. These men, and many others, showed that fame didn't exempt them from standing up for their beliefs, even if it meant outrunning flak guns or defying bigoted policies within their own ranks. Return to the spotlight, from battlefield to box office. When the war ended, the transition back to civilian life presented its own challenge. Some found the glitz and glamour of Hollywood jarring after seeing the brutality of real combat. Kirk Douglas, born Isur Danielovich, served as a communications officer in the Navy on patrol craft, charged with anti-submarine duties. After injuries sidelined him, he decided to pick up the shards of his pre-war dreams. The roles he chose, often portraying tough, complex men wrestling with moral dilemmas, resonated with an audience that had also been forever changed by the war. His experiences gave him an edge. The intensity in his eyes came from more than stage training. Charles Bronson similarly translated his grim war memories into a quiet ferocity on screen. Audience sensed the authenticity behind his stoic demeanor, especially in films like The Magnificent Seven or the Death Wish series. The difference between a typical action star and Bronson was that he genuinely lived through life or death missions. Viewers might not have known the precise reason, but they felt it in every line on his face. For some, like James Garner, G.I. Bill opened doors to acting schools and workshops, forging a path from foxholes to film set. Garner's casual warmth and self-deprecating humor had been tempered by the grit of real conflict, an appealing blend of toughness and charm that made him instantly likable on camera. Others, like Tony Curtis, returned to find themselves well-suited to thrive in the newly booming film industry. Curtis had served as a signalman aboard a submarine tender, the USS Protea, and even witnessed the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. That sense of witnessing history in the making lit a fire in Curtis to pursue his own destiny. He quickly rose from small bit player to leading man, guided by a confidence that could only come from surviving global war. Then there's Paul Newman, whose brush with death on the USS Bunker Hill instilled in him a deep-seated gratitude for every extra day he got. That gratitude manifested in philanthropic efforts and a caring persona that bled into his iconic roles. Newman seemed both wise and laid back on screen, a combination that can only spring from someone who has faced the fragility of life head-on. At times, the shift back into show business was complicated with scars of service. Christopher Lee rarely talked about his clandestine experiences, but they certainly certainly colored his choice of roles. He brought a chilling realism to characters who flirted with death or shadowy motives. A man who had possibly brushed elbows with sabotage missions in Africa or Italy needed no coaching on how to radiate menace. Meanwhile, Henry Fonda used the discipline and leadership skills he'd honed in the Navy to excel in subsequent film roles, some of which involved playing authority figures under crushing pressure. The Bronze Star pinned to his chest was more than a decoration. It was evidence that he'd navigated the storms of real battle. These stories remind us that behind every carefully crafted Hollywood persona, there's a human being shaped by personal trials, heartbreaks, and moments of profound courage. During World War II, the chasm between mythic movie star status and the relentless demands of war collapsed in dramatic fashion. Whether they served as intelligence officers unearthing classified secrets, aerial gunners braving scorching flak over Europe, or young sailors navigating hazardous waters, each of these legends stepped into a reality far more harrowing than any role a director could dream up. When the dust finally settled and these veterans returned to film sets, they didn't just bring home medals or wounds. They brought home a perspective forged in the crucible of global conflict. That perspective gave them depth and intangible authenticity that leaped off the screen. In an industry built on make-believe, these actors offered something undeniably real. And maybe that's why their best performances resonate so deeply, because we can sense that behind the camera, they'd already proven their mettle in ways that transcend art. If these extraordinary men could talk to us now, they might say that surviving war doesn't make you a hero. How you live afterward does. In that sense, their service is still unfolding, whispered through the characters they portrayed and the moral convictions they championed long after the fighting stopped. It raises a question worth pondering. How many more Hollywood icons quietly bore the weight of service without ever advertising it? And whose story might be waiting to be told next? Because for every well-known star who enlisted, there are dozens more whose war records went unpublicized, forever hidden between the lines of film credits and unspoken memories. So the next time you see a vintage film poster or watch an old movie on late-night TV, ask yourself, did that actor once risk his life for something bigger than stardom? The answer might just surprise you and remind us all that true heroism sometimes hides in the most unexpected places.